Thank you to all the members for supporting my channel. Hello there. With Nahida's banner on the way, I figured I should probably make a video talking about the little green Cabbage Patch Kid, because it's been a while since anybody's really talked about her objectively. Aside from myself, I mean, I did just make the video on meta breakers and Dendro and all that, and she was a pretty core staple of it, but gotta pay the bills, and her banner is right there. Let's go back a minute, okay? Elemental reactions in Genshin are the core theory of the game. Pretty much every team in some capacity will use an elemental reaction. Unless you are, one of those mono mains, mono hydro, mono pyro, mono geo, God rest your soul. And with a lot of the teams in Genshin, their core power comes from the ability to spark elemental reactions, dealing significantly more damage than would otherwise be possible with the use of traits like Electro Charge, Overload, Vape, Melt, Swirl, Bloom, Hyper Bloom, etc, etc. And throughout Genshin's early history, a lot of the more powerful teams were teams that weren't scared of applying elemental affinities. Tartaglia International, Ganyu Vape, and Freeze teams come to mind immediately, but over the course of time, we've seen teams slowly fade out from the beginning of Genshin to the midpoint of Genshin, where hypercarry teams became the main thing. With the release of characters like Hu Tao, Xiao, and Ganyu, and of course Eula later on, a lot of the more powerful teams in Genshin really wanted to push forward the metric of using some sort of hypercarry, and we see this with characters that release in the future like, of course, Kaedahara Kazuha was the first major hyper-carry buffer in the game. Not long after that, we saw the introduction of Ayaka and Yoimiya, who were characters that were entirely designed to be played upon one point in their kit, where you would buff their element as much as possible so that you could then bring your main DPS on the field and shred, rip, and tear with Yoimiya, or throw them down into your burst field with Ayaka. In the early points of Genshin, like I often say, it was very hard to build a team that didn't really revolve around this playstyle because a lot of the people who played Genshin were quite frankly new, and it takes anywhere from 4 to 6 months in order to build a whole team from scratch, assuming you're starting the game for the first time and don't know what you're doing already. So it wasn't until around late Inazuma where a lot of people were building teams and they began to realize, hey, the elemental mastery stat isn't dog shit, which is surprising, right? There's a whole stat in there that we've been ignoring for a long time, and we did, because elemental mastery became a dominating force near the end of Inazuma, and with the release of Sumeru, a lot of people had their eyes on the new Gilded set, which, on release, gave elemental mastery to the team while also increasing elemental mastery and attack a little bit more, making it so that it was a lot more viable for elemental mastery DPS to finally be a thing. On top of that, we received the Dendro meta, which I will admit, on Sumeru's initial release, the Dendro meta actually isn't that overpowered, like a lot of my comments have pointed out. Yes, it wasn't that good, but it wasn't because the element itself was bad and that the reactions were bad. It was instead because a lot of the characters that came out at the time simply didn't have any way of capitalizing on the incredible power that had Dendro at the center of the team's core, and that was because a lot of the early Genshin characters that came out in version 3.0 quite simply were very clunky or just not that good, with characters like Kolai and Dendro Traveler being the best Dendro applicators, while our only Dendro DPS was Tainari. A patch later, we got the release of Cyno and Nilou, and Nilou was a really powerful Dendro core-based character that could use Bloom as her major comp, and she was heavily locked into Bloom comps in general. And Cyno was an aggravate DPS, and also maybe a Hyper Bloom carry if you really wanted him to be that, meaning the people that ripped all their energy recharge stats off of Raiden Shogun were finally able to put them on a different character that was actually made for that role, and then immediately put them right back on Raiden Shogun because Cyno's energy recharge is abysmal. The fact of the matter was, with these early characters that released in this time frame, a lot of the characters quite simply were missing something. Elemental mastery was a hard stat to build around, and there really wasn't a lot of consistent, reliable Dendro application. Outside of the Dendro Traveler, we didn't have much. And while Bloom and Hyper Bloom were undoubtedly strong and Burgeon was there, and Aggravate was really good, we didn't have any way of consistently proccing Dendro in a way that didn't already compromise the team DPS in some capacity. Yeah, it is really cool having the ability to deal an absolute ton of damage with a couple Hyper Bloom cores, but who cares cares if you're not getting the cores often enough. It wasn't until the release of Nahida did we finally get the ability to efficiently proc these cores in a way that was reliable, and that's because Nahida's kit was entirely based around filling in the empty slots in the Dendro meta. It kinda feels like every Archon does that now that I think about it. Anyway, the point is, Nahida in general was one of the more powerful characters we've ever received in Genshin Impact's history, especially because at the time of her release, Elemental Mastery had recently received a massive buff, both in the term of changing how damage scaling works by increasing a character's level, and because we got new access to the Elemental Mastery sets like the Deepwood and the Gilded sets. So now, with the Elemental Mastery scaling cabbage in our hands, we were finally able to build Nahida and place her on the proper teams, and she did not disappoint. With the cast of Nahida's elemental skill, you could do a short little twirl around the field, quickly marking every single character and enemy on the battlefield with a little splash of Dendro, unless you're on controller, in which case it'd take you a hot fucking minute. Once Nahida has taken a screenshot of her surrounding vicinity, every single enemy that you marked will be splashed with a little icon of green. Once you trigger any elemental reaction on this character, every enemy marked with the current effect will take Dendro damage, as well as proccing a reaction on every single one of those enemies at the same time. Now, if you know anything about Genshin Impact, you know this is incredibly powerful for a lot of reasons. Nilou teams in general were able to quickly apply bloom reactions all over the field, and with Nilou blowing up bloom reactions super quickly, it was very easy for Nahida to be one of the most overpowered AoE damage clearers in the game. And since on normal Nilou bloom teams, Nahida would be the one proccing the reactions to begin with, and you only had to worry about building Elemental Mastery on the EM scale and carry, this only got stronger. Hyper bloom teams got finally consistent Dendro application that only needed to be reapplied once the enemy is dead, but because Hyper bloom was more single target damage focused, this meant that Hyper bloom was able to excel in single target, while Bloom was able to excel in multi-target. And with the release of characters like Sino and of course Raiden Shogun, like I mentioned earlier, finally having access to full EM builds and a consistent Dendro application, these teams too also became dominant. All of this, and we haven't even talked about Nahida's elemental burst yet, which is also pretty fucking impressive considering it really doesn't do that much in the grand scheme of things. All it does is cast a big church-wide effect over the arena, and as long as you remain within the chapel, you will receive an elemental mastery buff. And because the entire team's DPS lineup wanted to scale hardcore of elemental mastery, this meant that the entire team essentially got a pretty sizable buff just for Nahida existing on the team. And the buff would be even bigger if you have access to Nahida's weapon, but I'm not going to consider that because in all honesty, I don't think it's really relevant, because Nahida can function well with anything. Like I said earlier, all you really want to do is build a lot of elemental mastery on her, maybe like 30 crit and 100 crit damage, and you are golden. And on top of everything else, Nahida's teams are very easy to build. If you want to build a Hyper Bloom team, all you need is Nahida, a 5-star, Jingshou for Hydro Application, and Kuki Shinobu, a 4-star, in order to do Elemental Mastery. Boom, you're done. That's all you need. And conveniently, on the current Nahida banner, all these characters are running all at once. You might want to pick up an Alhaitham in the future in order to make the team a little stronger, but really, you don't need that if you're only looking to make the core of the team, which is more than powerful enough as is. If you want to make a Bloom team, all you need is Nahida, Nilou, and then maybe a Jingshou and some sort of healer. Yao Yao comes to mind. You want to make an Aggravate team? Okay, just put Nahida on literally any team with an electric character. Because all these characters are scaling off of Elemental Mastery, you're only really going to need to worry about energy recharge and maybe attack if you're using a character like Tainari or Alhaitham. But in most scenarios, it really doesn't matter that much. So essentially, what I'm telling you at this point is Nahida was dominant throughout her entire region of Sumeru because she was easy to build, her team comps were also easy to build, she excelled in single target combat with Hyper Bloom and multi-target combat with Bloom, she excelled with hyper carries with the use of Aggravate, and she is one of the more prominent characters that you can use throughout, well, even today. Because despite everything I've just said talking about how Nahida broke the meta, you might assume that Nahida would have been nerfed a lot like Ganyu and Venti, and you'd be wrong because she's still actually really good. I didn't realize how much so until a recent video I was walking around getting background footage for Nahida, and I was using a Hyper Bloom Nahida core as my main team without Alhaitham, and I am just fucking destroying everything. Hyper Bloom has not begun to fall off. Nahida has not even started to fall off, and as a matter of fact, I think that with time she'll only end up getting better, because eventually elemental reactions will be buffed, new artifact sets will come out, and there's always room for a 5-star instructor's artifact set. Please, for the love of God, god, Mihoyo, please do it. I want it so bad. So don't let people fear tactic you out of using Nahida. Yeah, she's good. She hasn't gotten much worse since she came out. I'd imagine she'd be even more powerful as the days go on. And with her banner being right around the corner, I highly recommend that you take some time, grab some gems, and pull Nahida on her upcoming banner to assemble the Hyper Bloom team core and dominate the entire game. That all being said, like, comment, subscribe. See ya.